Okay then, so this is week, what are we now? Week 6, I think. Just check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No, week 7. Time is flying past. And this week we're looking at learning environments in terms of the sorts of environments we find in educational organizations and how they've been structured and how they work as an environment to support student learning, but also the teaching process and other administrative processes to do with those learning environments. Remembering we place all of this in the context of your final assignment, where we're going to be looking at an implementation plan for making some changes to one of these learning environments, particularly as it relates to a change involving the use of educational technologies. So it's useful to understand some of the theory behind the concept of a learning environment. In the past, we would just call them schools or universities or other places with those sort of names. But over time, we've come to understand that they're actually far more complex, and that students, teachers, administrators, parents, and a whole lot of other stakeholders have played an important part in shaping the learning environment that occurs in any particular instance. And indeed, it can also be shaped by the local community and indeed the national and international communities that support those environments, particularly when we start talking about third world countries where there are attempts to introduce changes to the education system and establish learning environments that are different to what may have previously occurred in those countries, often modeling a Western approach to learning and teaching. And they can come into difficulties when they don't consider the local community and the national community and national approach to education that might exist in those countries. And indeed, they can even be influenced by an international approach, particularly where we're seeing this in Africa and parts of South America as well, where there's a lot of international actors wanting to have an influence over the development of these countries. And they also have a strong interest in seeing the education system develop. So there can be lots of different forces involved. But at the simplest level, it could be a classroom with a teacher and the students and possibly the parents and their influence, but also the principal and the rest of the school community having an influence over the nature of the learning environment that's created. But in more recent times, we've also seen online learning environments where we start going through a process of online teaching, as we're seeing in this course, where the nature of the learning process is changed through the mediation of particular technologies. So it's somewhat different to what used to be correspondence education, where people would receive things by mail, sometimes CDs or videos, but generally it was done what's called asynchronously. Now we're using technology such as video conferencing to do things synchronously, where we work together in an online space and as an online community. Now, Griffith University has gone an additional step, and they've created an online campus where they're defining the online interactions that can occur as a complete separate campus as part of the university. So we have a number of campuses, physical campuses, and we also have this new online campus. We're not quite sure what that's going to involve just yet, but it's a new initiative of the university to try to encompass the idea that there's a lot of interactions around the learning process beyond just the technologies and the individual academics and students that are involved in the process. There's student administration, there's a whole range of support systems for students, and of course the learning processes as we've more traditionally had with academics and students participating in various activities such as Blackboard Collaborate, or here we're using Google Hangouts or other technologies in that respect. So that sort of frames what we're going to be discussing tonight. Does anyone have any questions before we get into the readings? Okay, Connie. And I can see Henry shaking his head. So let's then have a look at the readings. So Henry has pointed out that I've made a bit of a mistake with one of the links in below the readings, but the first one should be okay. Actually, which was the first one? Whoop. So the first reading is quite long, but it does repeat itself quite a lot. So the idea here was how we're using different educational policies to transform the nature of the learning environment in a range of countries, in particular the use of ICTs within those countries. So skipping down, so there's a series of little case studies focusing on how technology has been incorporated into a range of countries: Singapore, Namibia, Jordan, Uruguay, and Rwanda. And then another one sort of just wrapping it up at the end in terms of a chapter looking at a summary of those different interacting factors. So if we just go first though to chapter 2, which sort of looks at the overall process. Chapter 1 is more of a literature review, looking at the historical development of ICT in different countries and the impact that technology can have on education in various countries. So just skipping down past all of that, which you've hopefully read. And here we are, chapter 2. So the first bit is this idea that technology can have a big impact upon education. We've always sort of played that as an aspect of education, be it from use of books or videotapes or televisions. Technology has always been seen as something that can have quite a significant impact upon education. But recent technological developments, particularly around the internet and learning management systems, and to a large extent artificial intelligence systems, have really changed the way we can conceptualize how much influence technology can have on the learning process. Where in the past we always acknowledged the teacher as the main dominant factor in the learning process, nowadays that's being challenged, and that technology is having an increasing ability to replace the teacher as a significant influencing factor in students' learning. So what do you think about this idea of the use of technology and the role of technology in education?
This was very interesting. I was reading the news from back home, and actually they're going to ban the use of mobile devices in schools. Apparently something's going on with um, bullying, and it's making the situation really difficult for teachers to implement technologies now. At one time, everyone was moving to that kind of technologies, and now it's like the government is backing up. I don't know why they took this. I think it's because of the amount of complaints and um, I don't know how you call it, like kind of lawsuits that have been uh, placed by people, and it's really actually it feels like we're going backwards instead of progressing about the use of mobile devices. So it's going to be a really interesting challenge once I go back and see how can I actually implement this, because I think that technology is one of the best tools you can use to actually achieve meaningful learning.
Yes, now it's a good point. And technology implementation, if done poorly, can have significant backlashes. And we're going to explore that in your implementation plans and why it's so important to get everyone that has a stake in the change to be supportive of the change. And yes, we've seen it in many countries, and indeed we've seen it to a certain extent here in Australia as well, and in Queensland, where there's been a backlash against the use of mobile devices, particularly around this concept of screen time. That's been used as the argument that students are spending too much time engaged with the use of technology, and it's having a detrimental impact upon their learning, their health and physical activity, and their social interaction. And each of these represents a fairly easily disproved conjectures. Very few of them have any basis in any real research or evidence, but they sound reasonable on the surface. But fortunately or unfortunately, depending upon how you look at it, they don't really stand up to any significant criticism. Whoops. One aspect around that is the idea that technology has detrimental impacts on learning. And there's a number of studies that have been conducted that show the reverse, and that technology does help support learning. There are aspects, as you mentioned, around distraction, but that has to do with the management and use of the technology more so than the technology itself and its effectiveness in supporting learning. If teachers don't supervise and manage student use of the technology, then students can go off and do things that we don't want them to, just as they could if they were using books. And indeed, books are a good counter-analysis to screen time technologies. Books represent very similar educational affordances to mobile devices. They can also be isolating, where students can go off and engage with a book by themselves. They can encourage obesity, where students are reading rather than exercising and engaging with that. And they can also give them access to lots of very strange ideas that we may not want them to engage with. Yet we've come to understand how to use books and how to incorporate those to support student learning, just as we will with new technologies as they've emerged. But that does take a little bit of time, and there is that lag. And unfortunately, as we find with any new technology change, there is a fear factor because it is different to how we grew up in our own learning. And because of that difference, we always relate any experiences we have to education with our own experiences when we went through schooling. And when they are different, we tend to see the negative aspects of any difference. We see that with lots of curriculum reforms around mathematics and literacy, and even to a certain extent science. So it's not at all unusual that we do see a backlash against the introduction of any technology, simply because of the differences it represents to the previously experienced ways of learning. And yes, as Connie also mentions, mobile devices are often banned, and they were banned in Australia for many, many years. But one of the biggest arguments against that is that if there are dangers from the use of this technology, and if there are detrimental effects of the use of these technologies for students in terms of their learning and their social engagement and all the rest, then if we simply ban their use at school, we abrogate ourselves from the responsibility of any education in relation to the use of these technologies. So if they are as detrimental as the critics do say, then it is more essential that they are used in schools so that students can learn how to use them effectively and appropriately, and be able to then mediate the potential negative consequences of the use of that technology. Simply saying that we don't want to be involved in that process means we're no longer then preparing students for the real world. Of course, the real world does incorporate the use of that technology quite extensively, and students are using that technology for their own recreation and their own social engagement. So to say that we don't want to be involved in that means that we then take education outside of the process of preparing students to socialize with other people, to engage with various activities online and do so in a responsible and educated way. But that said, there is a number of countries that have faced the backlash. France is probably the largest at the moment. They've introduced a mobile phone ban. In the main, though, we see that those things are fairly short term. I think I mentioned it previously, but I've still got the email that was sent out to all New South Wales teachers banning the use of the email because it was seen as a potentially distracting and disruptive and dangerous technology that could open up students and teachers to a whole lot of litigation and inappropriate behavior and all sorts of potential problems. But it only took a few years before we became accepting of that. The other thing about technology is that it's constantly changing, and that a technology that is scary today is no longer scary when the next technology comes along. And while mobile devices may seem scary at the moment, implanted devices, which are just on the horizon now, will displace all of our concerns about mobile devices when everyone starts worrying about having students with implanted memory devices and other technological, biological interface technologies. The whole idea of mobile devices will seem very inoffensive and unproblematic once more scary technologies come along that replace those technologies. So what do you think about those concepts? Please feel free to argue against them.
I used to have a lot of conflict with my students because the rule in my class was never to use a mobile while we were in class. But sometimes they would just never take notes. They will take pictures, and then they will have a full folder of all the whatever I wrote on the whiteboard or whatever activity they were doing in their desk. And for them, it was a source of information. So I decided that we could actually have a rule on how to use technology in the classroom so it will be useful instead of becoming a distraction. After, I don't know, like 2 or 3 months of clarifying these rules, it was very easy for them to actually know when to use it and when not to use it. So for me, technology is like, it's a big thing. That's why I'm so interested in it. Because eventually we will see that more and more technology will get into the classroom, and we cannot keep trying to stop the process from happening. Basically, because now most of them go to school with tablets, initially have internet access. And I'm talking about a school that is located in a poor neighborhood. So these are children that, have very low socioeconomic, they have a low socioeconomic background and still can afford this kind of technology because there are policies back home regarding the use of technology. So it's affordable for everyone and they can get it and start using it. And it helps them a lot. I mean, they can access a lot of information, and sometimes in class they will say, teacher, can I check this or that, and use it in the classroom. So it's actually giving them the right tools to use this technology. It's being there and guide them to, like I typed on the chat, it's about digital literacy, like how can you use this technology and make the most of it, learn in the process too.
Yes, no, and you raise a couple of good points there. One of the prevailing sort of trends at the moment is actually to challenge the authority of existing educational institutions to provide learning for students. And there is an argument being put forward by some that there is no longer a need for formal education, particularly at a university level, where students can gain access to knowledge and learning through a whole range of other alternative means now, particularly mediated by technology. And for countries and organizations and schools to put forward a very retrograde perspective that technology doesn't support learning is really challenged by the arguments being put forward by others that technology is so important for learning that it's actually replacing existing systems or has the potential to replace existing systems. So I think the argument that technology shouldn't be used in schools is a very, very tenuous one, simply because of the impact we're seeing technology can have on students' learning. And in particular, they're learning at a high level where they can do independent learning and learn how to become learners, which is the ultimate aim of all education systems, to create independent learners. But that does challenge some stakeholders, and it does challenge some teachers who have always been the authority in schools, and they don't sometimes like to see students having access to other forms of authority, such as the internet, Wikipedia, other resources that could potentially challenge what the teacher is saying about various topics and concepts. So that does present a few challenges, but most teachers now are coming to the understanding that they can't be experts on all the things that students are learning nowadays, and that they need to exist in a framework whereby they support student learning rather than be the ones that provide student learning. What are your thoughts on that concept? And welcome to the meeting, Adrian. So no real thoughts on that one?
I'm waiting for the rest to say something. If not, I have one
Okay, Henry,
short
go
remark.
ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking that that's why the new education paradigms, actually the conflict comes from the traditional paradigms. So the more progressive the paradigm is, the more welcoming it is of new technologies. And the thing is, that's when you see that the age gap does have an effect. The teachers that are more are lenient towards pedagogies that follow the traditional models will be more resistant to actually accept that change, while the progressive ones welcome this kind of learning. You know, like if you check like the Montessori or the constructivist approach by Vygotsky, you know that actually you are there to help them. Technology actually can be of a great help.
Yes, there's some other good points. And the framework that people get into does very much influence how they approach such changes and challenges. And part of that, as an educational leader in your organization and trying to affect change, is getting people into the right mindset to be accepting of the introduction of a new technology. And over the next few weeks, we're going to learn about a whole different set of strategies of how to actually get people to come on board with the changes we'd like to see in technology so that they become supporters of the implementation and take some ownership of that implementation rather than seeing it as a threat or something being imposed upon them. But we're getting ahead of ourselves just a little bit in that respect, but that's the ultimate aim we'd like to get to in terms of your implementation plan, to setting things up so that everybody feels as though they have ownership of the plan and want to see the change implemented, including the students, the parents, the government officials, everyone else, so that everyone is then supportive rather than opposed to the implementation. Because any implementation that's prepared and implemented without going through that process will always find opposition, simply because it's something new and being imposed upon people rather than having them supportive of the change. And we do find that happening in many schools, where parents are seeing that schools are requiring the use of these technologies, and they haven't been effectively convinced about the advantages and benefits of the technology to support their students' learning. Of course, most of the time, parents just see students using these devices for playing games and for recreation. They don't see them necessarily for the educational benefits of that. So there needs to be programs put in place to explain the benefits to parents to get them on board with the advantages of these technologies to support student learning. And likewise for politicians, we want to be able to demonstrate to them the things that are of particular interest to politicians, particularly around exam scores and comparisons with other states and other countries, and how technology can help improve those metrics that politicians are particularly interested in. The other aspect that politicians are interested in is getting re-elected and receiving votes. So if the parent body is brought on board and is supportive, and the community is seen as being supportive, then the political forces that could derail processes will tend to be supportive because they see their interest being served by supporting the change, even though they may not particularly care about the change itself. But because there is a groundswell of interest being generated by others, that then influences their decision-making processes. So these are all the sorts of things you'll need to think about when you come to do your second assignment around your implementation plan. Now, it may not be at a nationwide level, it may just be at a school level or even a classroom level, but the same sort of issues arise. Why would your principal be supportive of a particular technological change in your classroom? What benefits do they get out of that change? Will it benefit the learning of the school overall and improve the metrics of the school performance? Will it provide publicity for the school and for the principal? Will it show that the principal is an innovative principal and supportive of innovative changes in that school and get kudos and promotion opportunities through that? There's some influencing factors that we can apply just on the principal as a school leader. But there's lots of other stakeholders involved in any educational organization that have their own particular interests and agendas, and your implementation plan should identify those and cater for their particular needs so that they are supportive of the change. So Connie mentions to increase student motivation and engagement in learning. Well, certainly that's one of the main factors that most teachers would have around educational technologies and the introduction of those. And that tends to be the fallback position that we use, in that we can be fairly relied upon for all teachers to want to see a benefit to student learning. But that's not always enough, particularly where it's not proven to be the case with any particular technology. Of course, there hasn't been enough research done and things of that nature. So sometimes you need to work on other factors, such as their ability to be promoted. Or it might be the technology will save them time. We might use some online quizzes to save their assessment marking processes, or an online or a computer-based reporting system so that they don't have to spend so much time writing out school reports. Or it might be an online behavior management system so that they can just tick a few boxes and all of the paperwork they would normally have to spend around student behavior incidents could all be done quickly and automatically through some sort of digital system. But there should be some factors involved that relate to having teachers and anyone else come on board with technological change because of the direct benefits they see to that. Other than that, of course, we can, if we show sufficient potentiality for it to improve student learning, most teachers will still get on board with it then, but you still have some resistance. And that's where we looked at that innovation curve, where you've got the innovators and then the early adopters, then the late majority, and then the resistors Of course, teachers, because they're so busy and they've got so many other competing demands, will often leave things until the last minute or when they have to do it, unless they can be shown some real strong benefits for student learning or for their own potential interests in engaging with a technology before they have to. Okay, let's look a bit further through the reading. So here we look at how technology is, or education is changing from the mass production model of education through to preparing students for a knowledge creation economy. And certainly when we start looking at that aspect and we look at where all the employment prospects are in the future, then having students engage with technology and be familiar with and using technology in schools is seen as a natural requirement for preparing students for a knowledge economy. And that's where a lot of arguments are for the introduction of educational technologies. But then we also have its potential impact upon the learning process and the educational process. So we've got this idea of a learning ladder. So you've got where technology can improve basic requirements around health and welfare and access to education. Knowledge acquisition, where people can go and find new knowledge. Now that role used to be the role of libraries, and governments and communities spent a lot of money investing in libraries to provide the population with access to knowledge and information. That's now largely been supplanted by the internet and the World Wide Web as access to that. Then you've got knowledge deepening approaches, and this tends to be opportunities for further education, either at a tertiary level or in a community-based educational process. And then you've got knowledge creation, where we've got the ability to create new knowledge. And often this is done through research at higher education institutions, but not always. It can also be done through the arts and through other approaches where we create new value through our understanding of the world and through educational processes. Now, Adrian mentions, how about learning technologies to assist the teachers? And yes, there's a whole range of those, and we call those educational technologies. And they are certainly very important because they assist in the learning process for students in the long term by making teachers more efficient in how they can engage with the work. The more time we can free up teachers to interact and engage with students, the better the learning outcomes are for students. That's been shown time and time again. So there's a lot of work done to try to incorporate educational technologies that support teachers. It hasn't always worked. Email, for example, has been a bit of a failure in that respect. It was designed to make communication more effective, but because it made it so much easier, it then increased the volume of communication to a point where the efficiency of digital communication and electronic communication and emails in being able to reply to emails quickly and easily has been overwhelmed by the quantity of email communication that has resulted from that same efficiency. So it was originally intended that that would free up a lot of teachers' time so they wouldn't have to reply to parent phone calls and meetings and all the rest, but it didn't quite work out that way. Now, Adrian also mentions they can recommend efficient tools for teaching. There needs to be a way to reduce IT administrative burdens of teachers. Yes, absolutely, Adrian, and that's been relatively well acknowledged. It used to be that schools had to employ teachers to manage school networks and all the computers in a school. Most schools now and school systems outsource that to IT professionals and technical support staff that look after providing the technical support for teachers in the use of computers and other technologies in their schools. It's not to say that if you were going to do something very innovative, such as something to do with robotics or drones or other technologies, that you wouldn't have to do a lot of that on your own. But mainstream technologies such as computers and whiteboards and those sort of ones have largely been outsourced because it's seen that the role of the teacher is to support student learning, and we want to try to reduce any other activities that impact upon that primary role. Now, we haven't quite got there when it comes to administrative processes and in particular testing and assessment. That's ballooned in terms of the amount of time that teachers have to spend engaged with those processes, and unfortunately technology hasn't necessarily made that easier, and some would argue that they've made it somewhat worse. So sometimes there are benefits and sometimes there are unexpected consequences. And again, that is part of that whole process of trying to understand the systems involved and to try to work out if we do make these changes, yes, we can see these effects that we think should happen, but what are the potential unintended consequences? If we introduce online testing, that sounds really good. It's going to replace a whole lot of time spent doing other tests, paper-based tests, which are quite administratively difficult and quite complex to mark and time-consuming. But an unintended consequences, one of the ones that looks like is now emerging, is the fact that we're going to have a whole lot of stakeholders external to schools want to have testing occur regularly. And there's talk of NAPLAN being done on even a 6-monthly, or some are even arguing monthly basis. Because if we do go to NAPLAN online and online testing, it means we can test whenever these other stakeholders want. And they can create the tests and distribute them out to all the schools and require them to do those. And so we actually end up having much more testing because of the technology, even though it was meant to reduce the administrative burden and inefficiencies of traditional testing processes. So again, we need to think through all of the systems involved and what might occur with the introduction of a new technology, so that we can try to ensure that the best outcome for the organisation and for student learning and education is the result, and not other consequences that we may not have originally thought of. Okay, moving on. So that just goes through and elaborates the idea of basic education, knowledge acquisition, knowledge deepening, and knowledge creation. And many countries are trying to implement policies that encourage knowledge creation. Of course, they see that as one of the key drivers of the economy, and having a population that is engaged with technology and creating new knowledge that can then be sold onto other countries and be of great economic benefit to the country that gets ahead in the knowledge creation race. And many, many countries, including Australia, are hoping that that will occur in their nation. There are examples where it has occurred. Ireland is one where they set in place a whole range of policies to attract innovative engagement with educational technology and transform the entire economy around knowledge creation. So that was certainly a major success story. Singapore, to a large extent, is trying to do the same, and a number of other countries that are also positioning themselves, including a number of Middle Eastern countries, which they're seeing the long-term consequences of the move away from reliance upon oil and the need to have another economy, because they've become quite used to being very, very wealthy. But as the world shifts away from reliance upon fossil fuels, they realize that they don't have an awful lot of other natural resources to rely upon, and they don't have any industrial capacity in their countries, so they have to come up with a new way of sustaining their standard of living. And they're hoping that they can use their current wealth and invest that in a knowledge creation economy that will then see them continue to be successful into the future. Okay, so all of this can be driven by policy, and in particular in third world countries, which is what this particular sort of document explores, although it includes a number of other countries that aren't third world, such as Singapore. But it looks at how we can implement policies that can drive change in an organization, in this case a country, to see success. So some of these ideas you can apply and use in your small scale policy initiative in terms of your implementation plan as to what effects it will have upon your organization, the intended effects that you want to see through your vision statement that you create as to what you want to see as a result of your planned change, through to the various other aspects of policy development. Professional development will be a major part in terms of bringing your teachers up to speed with the change. Will it change the educational process in terms of pedagogical change? Will it include changes to the curriculum? Will there be different things taught? Will you help prepare students for a knowledge creation approach in being able to use their understanding of technology and their engagement with technology to transform the way that they're actually learning about and learning of new approaches and ways of thinking and so forth around this engagement with technology? Will it change the way you go about assessment? Could it change the actual way you structure the learning environment itself? Will you need a physical school? Could everything be done online? Could you have satellite schools? So rather than having one central school, you could have a whole lot of smaller schools that all work together. Could you have the community involved in the school far more than what's traditionally done? So there's a whole range of approaches that you can explore. And then, of course, there's the implications on the technological infrastructure. Will you have the bandwidth and the technologies and so forth to be able to cope with the ideas and implementation that you would envisage for your organization? And if not, what has to change in terms of the technology to support that? So there's many of the factors you should start to be thinking about in terms of your own organization and what sort of aspects have to be developed in terms of your implementation plan for it to be as successful as you would hope. So there's a table here that provides a summary, and it goes through 4 levels of development, from basic education needs, knowledge acquisition needs, knowledge deepening, and knowledge creation. And it provides just a nice overall summary of how things can progress in each of those categories. Any thoughts on that? So remember, the idea of these video conferences is for us to discuss the readings, not necessarily for me to just summarize them for you. So let's have a conversation.
Should it be like when we are actually, I'm thinking of the educational system back home, and that's because it's where I'm going to apply this implementation process. I was actually, it took me a while because I was looking while we were in the lecture. I was looking for some information in the Ministry of Education, and we have a lot of documents that say how we should approach the technology, the use of technologies in the classroom. And this document is from 2014. So far, it looks like it's mostly based on the reading. On the latter is on the knowledge deepening part. So they already consider that most teachers are above the other two levels of the ladder, which is not completely true. So they are operating with these assumptions, and basically that's what we are going to do in our when we are trying to transform this system. So should we just start from the beginning and try to actually like diagnose how the system is really working and say we should start from the basic level and then move on? Or we just can, like leapfrogging, which sometimes can be problematic too, and just go ahead and let's go for the knowledge deepening approach, or let's go for the knowledge production approach. Which one? I mean, this is a very interesting framework when I was reading about it, and it was like, now in this case, the policy back home is really about knowledge deepening, but most teachers refuse to use a computer just to type notes, for example. So they started on this leapfrog approach, and this could lead to actually people saying no totally to technology.
Yep. Now you raise another very good point, and that is at what level you pitch your changes. And what we tend to find the most successful is to have a laddered approach where you make an initial change and then that leads on to the next level of change and then to the next level of change. Going too quickly and too far can disenfranchise and disengage many of your stakeholders. But that said, you still want to show the aspirational aims because they represent why the change is important and provide your arguments as to how much impact these changes will have on the overall learning environment eventually. But going straight to that point can be very problematic. So most successful approaches are you get to understand where most of your stakeholders are, and particularly your teachers in the argument here, and then how to get them to the next step. And then understanding, okay, once we get to there, then we need to go to this next step. And then might need to go to another step, and then we start achieving our overall goal. But going straight to the final step can often be problematic on a whole range of issues. Not the least is the technological infrastructure. There can be a whole range of other factors involved. It could be parental backlash, even student engagement, because students need time to learn about how to start really working with digital technologies as well. They can't go from using them just for games and then straight into using them at a high level to support their learning. There's a range of different stages they need to progress through. So everyone needs to move along and move towards the ultimate aim, but you still set your vision where you want to be. It's how you get there, though, is the approach that you need to describe and detail to your stakeholders. And that will almost always involve a series of steps that move towards that. So I hope that answers the question. But yes, some policies do lack that practical process and they set the vision. Often, of course, they've looked at where other countries or other high-performing schools have achieved and say, we want to do the same. But it ignores the fact that those other countries or schools have gone through a series of steps to get there. Now, that doesn't negate the fact that we can sometimes leapfrog, as you said. As is being seen in Africa, they're leapfrogging the whole fixed phone line system, and they're going straight to mobile technologies. So they're ignoring all the need to put in telephone cables throughout the country, throughout the nation, in fact, the continent even, and they're going straight just to mobile phone towers, and so saving a huge amount of investment that other countries had to go through to invest in landline communications. So there are some advantages to coming along after others and being able to see the mistakes and the processes that they went through and accelerate that process. But in the main, you still need to go through a series of steps to achieve any real significant change. So I hope that answers your question there, Henry. So Adrian and Connie, what are your thoughts? Is that a question, Adrian, or are you making a statement? Okay, well, yes, it's widely acknowledged that the teacher is the one that has the most significant influence upon student learning. But that said, a teacher alone can't necessarily implement the change if they don't have the support of other stakeholders. Your school administration and your school leadership need to be supportive, normally. Students need to be supportive. Parents need to be supportive. Government policy in terms of curriculum and things of that nature need to be supportive. Otherwise, you'll find other demands requiring you to do other things other than the initiative that you want to see happen in an educational organization. But yes, you're totally correct that in our current education systems, the teacher is the central factor. But that said, there are some people that argue that online systems and AI systems could take the teacher out of that dominant role. And there is some argument around curriculum reform that teachers should be taking a less dominant role because we no longer need teachers to be the keepers of knowledge. They need to be much more around the coaching role and the supportive role, and that the dominant factor in any school environment should be the student, with the teachers supporting students in terms of their learning processes. And that support can also come from people external to the school, other than the teacher. We should be using much more parents and other experts that students should be engaging with, rather than just the one single teacher that's allocated for a group of students. Of course, that's been a model that's served us well for a number of generations, but the technology now allows us to do things in ways that we can explore the idea of the teacher-student relationship quite differently to how we've done so in the past. But again, that is a change in itself that needs a lot of stakeholder support, not the least from teachers, but also from students and other groups that are also involved. Okay then, let's have a look at one of the case studies and then we'll go to our second reading. So we'll stick with Singapore. It's the first one. Singapore is quite an interesting country because it has a lot of advantages, but also a lot of disadvantages, which makes them very, very agile and innovative. Because of their small size and a number of other countries around them that have, in the past have been not always friendly, and also because it's had a complicated history with colonialism and other aspects that have influenced its role in the region. But also because of its geographical location, it had some very useful advantages around trade and have been very successful in managing those processes. But because of their innovation and their long-term perspective on many things, although they have a short-term perspective on technological change, but long-term in terms of their economy, they put in place very strong policy directions and try to see those through. So education has been a very strong factor in Singapore's policy development long before it was popular to do so in many countries. And in the main, it served to make Singapore a very innovative educational environment. That said, they have challenges. They have a large Chinese population and other ethnic groups, and the whole process of Western versus Eastern education really becomes very obvious in Singapore. Singapore wants to be a very innovative and creative society, but they do have a strong influence from Eastern education systems that rely upon a more traditional approach to education, which involves mastery learning and a lot of teacher-directed instruction. And the role of the teacher is still, in the main, quite dominant as the authority in the learning space, rather than in the Western environments where the authority has shifted very much towards the students in learning spaces. Yes, Adrian, rote learning to a certain extent, although rote learning has certain negative connotations. I would prefer the term mastery learning, where they do go through and follow a very rigorous learning process, much more so than we do in most Western education systems. And that has certain advantages, but it has certain disadvantages. And they're well acknowledged in Singapore's education system, particularly around their ability to have students be innovative and creative. But they are very much acknowledging this and working very hard to try to work out a blending of the two approaches. And they do so in very, very innovative ways. So while there's things that can be seen as negatives to that approach, there are also some things that the Western education system can learn from. And Singapore is a great example of the intersection between the two approaches. So they've done various master plans where they've explored the use of technology in education, and they were doing so before most Western countries. Singapore saw the effectiveness of technology very, very early. In fact, they were doing stuff around augmented reality 20 years ago, which was only just becoming introduced into Australian and US schools at the moment. One of the problems with the Singapore system is, though, that they do so much innovation that they don't tend to embed things for the long term. And some of the things that have proven to be really, really innovative tend to be replaced by new innovations, where if they were left to mature and develop and become embedded into the education system, they would see larger long-term impacts. So that's part of the challenges, and we can find that in a lot of innovative schools and systems, where if you get used to being innovative, you are always looking for the next new thing to do. And sometimes you forget that some of the practices that seem now old were once innovative in themselves. And we shouldn't always throw out practices simply because they've been around for a while. So we can see these various master plans and the lessons that they've learnt from those. And in particular, they've paid some very good attention to the idea of preparing their teachers to be able to teach in this innovative way. And yes, Adrian, that is one of the advantages and disadvantages of being an innovative culture. The advantages are that you're always coming up with new ideas and new approaches for doing things. But the disadvantage is you're always coming up with new ideas and approaches for doing things. Sometimes systems do need time to settle and mature themselves into an organization, and that doesn't always happen in that case. But yeah, so you can read about the different contexts. Singapore obviously also has the advantage of being quite small, and so being able to roll out infrastructure in terms of fiber optics and other technologies is made easier by the size of the country. And we can see in terms of their number of schools and teachers, they're not a huge nation in that respect, but they do work very hard to maintain that innovation throughout all the different aspects that we've talked about, particularly around professional development and technical infrastructure. And they have the agility to be able to try to have all of those things fit together and work reasonably well. Now, it's not perfect by any means, but the government there does spend a lot of money on trying to support education. And you could read some more stuff about the report and how it's analysed the system in Singapore. And this gives you an idea at a national level of the sorts of things you could consider in your implementation plan for your own organisations. You will have a master plan for your implementation plan, and these case studies represent those implementation plans being applied at a national level in various contexts. Sometimes they worked well, and sometimes they didn't. So here we see some of the goals, the strategies that they applied, their budget, and then they came, and as we talked about before, there was a staged approach. So the goals from the first master plan then leads into the goals for the second master plan towards their overall final goals. And one advantage of doing a staged approach is that you can adjust your goals. Sometimes you discover that your original goals weren't ambitious enough, or that new technologies and approaches have come along that provide new opportunities that you hadn't thought of or didn't exist when you first set your vision, and it allows some changes to occur. Now, that said, you have to be careful that the changes simply don't become excuses for not achieving the goals and reframing your goals towards lesser achievements because you haven't been as successful in the approach that you've taken. So your goals should always be ambitious and aiming towards what you see as the ideal environment for your educational organization, but they shouldn't be inflexible. And if things should change and goals should no longer be adopted, then your implementation plan should take that into consideration. And we build in that processes of evaluation and reassessment of the processes, normally every couple of years, just to make sure that we really do still want to achieve the goals that we've set out to achieve. And we see here a little conceptual map, a little bit like the systems thinking map that you would be doing for your assignments. Trying to consider all the different influencing factors that come to play upon the organization, or in this case, the country. So you could see that this conceptual map could have been expanded out into a systems thinking map and showing the interactions between each of those in a more complex way than simply as a Venn diagram showing intersections. Then we can see the strategies that they applied. So looking at what their current state is and what they want to actually be at. And again, you'll do the same in your implementation plan. And some of the factors that they've considered: professional development, capacity building within the schools. Some things like leadership development is an important one that's been acknowledged, not so much in the Singapore model, but in other models. In this case, they've put some approaches into doing research and development, trying to go beyond what they currently think they could do to come up with other ways and other approaches. And then, of course, you have your infrastructure and your support networks that ensure that the actual technology works sufficiently so that the implementation can be successful. And again, this then goes through their next steps in their staged approach. And just some people talking about how it worked and didn't work and so forth. Okay, so any comments about these as case studies with regards to implementation plans? So we're looking at countrywide case studies, but the same concepts apply, as we see throughout this course, to any level of approach, even be it down to a single classroom and a teacher wanting to introduce a digital projector into the classroom. The same policy-based decisions still apply, even though you may just be talking to your principal and your school budget director or your local PNC to raise money to buy the projector, whether or not the students will engage with the use of the projector, whether or not teachers need to be taught about how to use the projector, things of that nature. Okay, good, Adrian. Now, Henry mentioned, so we can convert our connection circles to a Venn diagram. No, sorry, Henry, that's a misinterpretation. I was saying more that they could have taken their Venn diagram and converted them into well, not connection circles, but the mapping that can be done using systems thinking. You could consider Venn diagrams as a very, very simplistic systems thinking approach, but it doesn't show the nuances of interconnections other than by grouping things together. And as we've seen through our systems thinking tools that we've looked at, connection circles and flow diagrams and so forth, a lot more can be understood by considering how different stakeholders interact with each other. Venn diagrams do a little bit, but it's more just naming them and putting some groupings to those names. Systems thinking should take things a step beyond that. Okay, let's look then at the second reading. So this one explores an idea of thinking that educational organizations, and in particular when they start using technology, represent social organizations. And if we just jump past the literature. So we start looking at what they've called a social infrastructure framework. So again, thinking about all of the stakeholders involved in the use of these technologies. So it's not so much the technology that's going to determine the success or failure of that technology in an educational organization. It's very much the people involved and the stakeholders and how they're going to engage with that technology. And they create a number of dimensions. The cultural belief dimension, which is the mindset of how education works in that organization, and the beliefs about how technology can be useful or not useful in the way that learning occurs in an organization. So if everyone is just used to teachers standing up in front and presenting information and students copying that information down, that changes the way we consider how different technologies could be useful. Then we have a practices dimension, which relates to the way that teachers and students engage with learning activities. So whether or not they work individually or in groups, or how that all occurs in an organization. So what actually students do with the technology. Are they going to just use it at school? Are they going to use it at home when they do their own independent study or homework? Are they going to use it in working together in groups, or is it just it might just be used for testing purposes or other aspects of the technology. Then you've got what's called a socio-techno-spatial relationship dimension. So this involves the interrelationship between the physical space and the online space, and how we interact between those two spaces. So you could take that as a model for this course, where we don't have a lot of physical interaction, but we have various online interaction through the course website, through these online videos, whether or not you're watching this as a video or whether or not you're engaged with it in the online video conference. All of this shapes the way that the learning occurs in a particular organisation. And then we've got the interactions with the outside world dimension, which is how students and often also teachers and the organisation itself interact with others. In particular, as I mentioned before, the idea shifting from the idea of the teacher and the school containing all of the learning that occurs for the students to the idea that a lot of learning can occur with others outside of the school context, but that can be increasingly facilitated within the school organisation and by the teacher. So the teacher providing links to experts and other sources of learning outside of the school. In the past, we've seen this through the introduction of textbooks. That brought expertise from outside the classroom into the classroom. But more and more now, we can have students go online and access online texts, or the equivalent of in terms of websites, but also go directly to online experts. And these experts will provide support for their learning, different to how their teacher provides support for their learning. Now, that can be very, very confronting to many teachers who are used to being the authority in their classrooms. But if they can reframe their conceptualization and accept that external experts can greatly support their students' learning, that can be very beneficial in terms of creating that dimension. So they represent the social or very social dimensions, and it goes the reading then goes through in a bit more detail. So I'm hoping that you've read through some of this. Let's just go to the conclusion and then we'll discuss things. So there's a few tables there and considerations that we could be looking at, what the study looked at. And the study came up with these as the main factors influencing K-12 education. The software that was being used, the technical infrastructure, the social infrastructure, the ways in which the learning tools fit into the curriculum and the standards involved in that curriculum, and the teacher's knowledge of how to use the technologies. So while they started off with quite a complex socio-cultural framework, it then came down to some very practical factors that they saw being the most influential in the classroom context. So how do you go about establishing a social infrastructure for your learning organisation is what the paper then concludes with. So if you were going to consider these factors as part of your own change that you wanted to see in a learning organisation, there's various things to consider that they then go through. Where's their summary? Okay, now it's going through their case study where they looked at the teaching of religious studies through the use of technology. And the needs of their various aspects to fit that model. And here we are, their conclusion. Okay. So in the conclusion, it's a model of 4 factors that should be considered if you want to create a social dynamics in a learning organisation that support learning. That's what they did their case studies around and explored the use of technology in various schools, and in particular around the use of teaching of comparative religion and how technology could support teaching and learning in that. And they applied their social infrastructure framework to better understand what was occurring in that learning space as a result of that model. Questions and comments? Do all organizations have social infrastructure? Yes. Any organization that includes more than one person would by necessity have some social infrastructure in terms of the various interactions between individuals in an organization, the technological infrastructure that's needed to support whatever's occurring. So all of the factors that were discussed in that paper could be seen in any level of organization. Okay then, if there's no other questions about or comments from that paper, let's go back then to the general theme for this evening, and just going to see if this video plays through what we're doing here. Let me just get this ready. I'm not totally sure if this will work through Hangouts, but let's see. Hangouts used to be very good at sharing videos, but the options seem to be missing. So let's see how it goes.